Okay. All right. Welcome on in. Zoom has crazy new rules. I would love to do it. As far as the newsletter, so I guess we're just going to start with some stuff. So newsletter is going to be coming out hopefully next week. I have some stuff I'm working on in the background. I have a nice announcement that I'm going to make at the end of this. So stick around for that. But the newsletter, my plan is probably next week. Maybe this week, probably next week. That being said, let's just jump right into EMFs here. So specifically the non-native ones, but we need to talk about non-native EMFs. We have to talk about regular electromagnetic fields. So an EMF is just an electromagnetic field. It is a region in space where electric and magnetic forces essentially interact. Now, interestingly, there are two kinds of fields here. Now, an EMF, as the name might entail, has an electric field and a magnetic field. Probably not too surprising. The best example of an electric field, I would say, at least in the natural world, the most obvious one that we could physically see is lightning. And on a smaller scale, like you might see, like, have you ever been shocked by, static electricity, if you're walking on a carpet or something of the sort? That would be an example of a natural electromagnetic field. Now, electromagnetic fields are made through voltage. Voltage is essentially what you measure the strength, if you will, of the electric field. However, an electric field can exist when there's no current flowing. So you can actually have an electric field that is quote unquote static, like it's not moving. A magnetic field, though, is different. A magnetic field actually has to have a flow of electricity. So if an electric field is static, i.e. not moving, there will be no magnetic field. However, if there is a flow of electricity, if it is actually flowing, then the magnetic field is going to occur. And usually it's going to rotate around the flow of electricity. So in my case, say we have an electric field that's going from my right to left. The magnetic field is essentially rotating around it as I go. So that's essentially what's happening. That's why when you look at pictures of like the Earth and it has kind of like the vortexes, it almost looks like a torus. That is essentially like what you're seeing is that electromagnetic field. Because the planet is electric. There's a flow of electrons that come from solar radiation, i.e. photons in, and it creates a charge. So the ionosphere is essentially more positively charged, whereas the surface of the Earth is more negatively charged. That's where grounding comes in, but we're not going to talk about that too much today. So where do EMFs, come from? Well, obviously, I just mentioned one. We have sunlight, we have lightning. Anything that's going to run on power, especially if it's consistently moving, is going to create an electromagnetic field. If that stops, say you turn off your light switch, that EMF is going to get shut off because there is no current flowing at the time. Even though it is an electrical circuit, that circuit is disconnected. That's what a light switch is. You're connecting or disconnecting a flow. So when you're shutting that off, the electric field might still exist, but the magnetic field won't because there is no flow to complete the circuit. Your laptop certainly can do it. Electric appliances, so light bulbs, microwaves, refrigerators. If you have an electric stove, obviously that'll do it. That's going to be a big part of it. So what we know with EMFs is they can affect particularly non-native ones, and that's why we're going to get into issues. So, EMFs, generally speaking, they're expressed in terms of frequency and wavelength, and these are inverses. So, and I'll share my screen for this because this is kind of important to understand. Okay. So we can see here in this image, again, wavelength and frequency, and they're inverses. So the longer the wavelength, the shorter the frequency. Frequency is essentially the number of full cycles per second or unit time. In hertz, as you can see here, they're done per second. So 1 hertz means 1 cycle per second. It takes 1 second to go through a full cycle and end up where you started. This is why wavelength and frequency are inverse. So you will see, you will have, as you go down the electromagnetic spectrum here from left to right, you're going to have shorter wavelengths, higher frequencies, because you're getting more full cycles in a shorter amount of time. And you'll see in the middle here, whoops, we have, you're going to get things like the infrared spectrum, which has again, longer wavelength, lower frequency. The ultraviolet end of the visible is going to have shorter wavelength, higher frequency. So when we're looking at the electromagnetic spectrum, that's kind of what we're seeing. And in between, there are other things too. So past UV, this is where you're going to get to ionizing radiation. That's X-rays, that's gamma rays. These are very high frequency, but they have a short wavelength. And then you have the non-ionizing, more on the infrared side of things, where you're going to have microwaves, radio frequencies, etc. And there's other things that fall on, as you say. So we have sunlight is obviously going to fall in the visible spectrum. We have microwaves, TV, AM and FM radios, power lines, etc. So that's what's happening. Now, as I mentioned, hertz are essentially the measurement of frequency, so cycles per second. So a megahertz, which you'll see MHz, is sometimes shortened, is 1,000,000 cycles per second, where giga is 1,000,000,000 cycles per second. So the higher the hertz, the greater the hertz. Essentially, the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. So it's important to kind of understand that as you're going. So that is a big part of it. Now, we can differentiate. Now, some of these, as you saw, like some of these are natural. Sunlight is obviously natural. Infrared, ultraviolet, these are things that we see naturally occurring. Now, there are certainly ones that occur outside of our visible spectrum. In fact, most of the visible spectrum of light is less than 1% of all of the wavelengths that are potentially viable. So it's a very small percentage of what we see. And this is actually where vision is really important and kind of cool. So so vision, taking a step back, what we see through our eyes is not an image of like what actually is. It's our perception of reality. And what the eyes do is they take in information based on our spectrum of what we can see, which is what we call visible light. And it goes into the brain and it creates an image of what is probably there. In other words, I know this microphone, I don't know, I see this microphone is right in front of me. And what the brain is doing in that time is not telling me exactly that there's a microphone there. It's based on the light coming in through the window that's coming into my eyes, and then the brain is making an approximation based on that light information coming in, what is where. And if that sounds different than like seeing physically what is, imagine it this way. Imagine, or maybe you know someone who's colorblind, or even better, what if you take a snake, for example, that can see into the infrared spectrum? So if I was a snake, I would be perceiving this microphone in a much different way than perhaps you or I. Or you could look at it another way. Maybe you have a pet cat or a pet dog. They perceive the world in a much different way than we do, because they do not see what we call the visible spectrum, or at least not the whole thing. They can see a different portion of that spectrum. Vision in and of itself is quite fascinating, but it's important to kind of understand that. Now, of course, then we have man-made or non-native EMFs, which generally speaking, they're broken up into two different types. We have low frequency EMFs, or you'll call them extremely low frequency. So lower frequency are going to be longer, more wavelength, lower frequency, longer wavelength. And these are usually what's transferred through wires, and they generally relate to electrical power systems that carry electricity. Radio frequencies, which are sometimes called RF radiation, these are higher frequency EMFs, and generally they're going to be in the 10 megahertz to 300 gigahertz range. And this category of EMFs is transferred through the air. So this is where we're getting wireless. This relates to your cell phones, your Wi-Fi, your Bluetooth. This is where all of that's going to come from. Now, I was mentioning currents before because you have to have a flow of electricity to have a magnetic effect. Generally speaking, we have DC and AC currents. DC is a direct current that flows in one direction and creates a static field without variation. So there's no variation to it. An alternating current, or an AC current, is an electromagnetic field that is most often used in our homes. So it's transmitted through wires or through the air into the ground, and the AC currents reverse direction, which causes changes in the electromagnetic fields. And these electromagnetic fields, whether they're man-made or natural, are in our world all the time. And remember, we are electrical beings before we are material ones. So that is important to kind of understand that. And our exposure to these man-made EMFs has, of course, increased dramatically over the past 100, but especially within the last 20 years. With the advent of cell phones and the popularization of the internet and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. There was a time, and I'm sure, my parents talk about it, like where, they had 5 cable stations that they used to watch. Now you can get hundreds of them literally on your phone. And now we have streaming services, and it's gone a whole separate way. Almost all. So that's essentially like kind of what's going on. So then we get to kind of this idea of ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. And if you remember from what I was saying before, non-ionizing tends to be more on the infrared side of things, lower frequency, longer wavelength. Ionizing, shorter frequency, greater wavelength. Shorter wavelength, more higher frequency. So that's essentially what's going on with that. Now, what's happening is we have particles that we call quanta that are transmitted through electromagnetic waves. And some electromagnetic waves have so much quantum energy that they can break the bonds that hold molecules together. And when these molecules break free, some of them are called free radicals. Now, free radicals tend to be positively charged. This is important because we have antioxidants, which are generally negatively charged. And essentially, a combination of them allows us to neutralize free radicals when there's buildup. However, if you have excess free radical buildup, it's associated with inflammation, with cancer, with aging, with most of the chronic diseases we see today. So when we have a high free radical exposure, and this is partially done through radiation, ionizing radiation, it's going to cause some issues. So, at lower levels, technically speaking, non-ionizing radiation is when energy levels cannot break these molecular bonds, so we call it non-ionizing. So again, this would be things like microwaves and electricity and radio frequencies. And that's the difference essentially between the two, is the frequencies themselves, can they create ions, i.e. free radicals, or can they not? Now, that in and of itself is controversial because a lot of the stuff that we talk about that affects us can happen in the non-ionizing range, i.e. things like microwaves and things of that nature. Be that as it may, we'll just kind of keep going and we'll kind of understand it. So where this tends to come out is there are different organizations that put out safety guidelines for electromagnetic frequencies. And the main guidance, generally speaking, comes from the World Health Organization, which we all know. But there are other organizations as well, such as the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation and Protection, the ICNIRP. There are other organizations like the International Committee on Electromagnetic Safety. The EU actually looks like that. The United Working Group, International EMF Collaborative. Yes, Coach Genshi, microwaves are good for storage as long as you don't turn the microwaves on, for sure. But unfortunately, like a lot of these and the most current guidelines around EMFs are based on evidence demonstrating whether there is a thermal effect. In other words, what they consider damaging is, does the frequency of whatever we're talking about actually heat up body tissue? If it doesn't, then it's considered safe, which is not only incorrect, what we're going to dive into why, but you can't use that as the only type of thing. So then we have a more reliable kind of way to look at things would be to use the Institute of Building Biology. You know, the most reliable information you could find on EMFs is probably from the Bioinitiative Working Group. They come out with the Bioinitiative report, and what they have found is that the current guidelines for EMF exposure were obviously way too lenient, as we're seeing. And in fact, they were lenient to the degree of 1,000 times too lenient. In other words, if we're looking for quote unquote safe exposure, we're at levels right now that are roughly 1,000 times too high, according to, again, the Bioinitiative Working Group. You know, another organization called the Institute of Building Biology has some good resources as well. So we have the Bioinitiative Working Group, and we have the Institute of Building Biology. What they were able to find, you know, if you compare even the lowest, strictest levels of the building biology groupings, there is a difference in many orders of magnitude versus like where we are now. So, you know, the levels in nature are low. However, what we're exposed to on a regular basis is really starting to kind of cause some issues. And ideally, you know, you should aim to reduce your exposure to, you know, these non-native EMF fields and radio frequency radiations as much as possible. And we'll talk about some strategies as far as to kind of get out of that. You know, particularly this becomes really difficult unless you have like a reader for this where you can kind of gauge this. You know, that becomes a real issue. And you could find some of these. Again, as far as the names of the groups, I'll go over it again. We have the Institute of Building Biology, and we have the Bioinitiative Working Group. So that would be, those would be the two groups. So, you know, really, like we're essentially doing a worldwide test, and unfortunately, a lot of the research on EMFs is gate kept. A lot of, you can look into some of the work done by Verizon and these other big groups, and they actually talk about it in their financial reports each year that they have to share publicly with their shareholders. And it talks about how like there are potentially dangers and they have to budget a certain amount of money out for potential legal reasons because of what's going on here. So it really comes down to, you know, what are the ways that we can shield and protect ourselves, you know, on a regular basis? How can we limit our exposure? How can we equalize, you know, this exposure on a regular basis? The first thing would be, and this isn't the easiest, but the first thing would be, you know, if you have any sort of like metal implants that are unnecessary or you could potentially get rid of, and particularly the first thing that would come to mind would be like mercury amalgam fillings. Getting those out would be incredibly helpful. I do find that folks who have like mercury amalgam fillings or some sort of metal implants tend to be the folks that are a bit more sensitive to electromagnetic exposures. So that would certainly be the first part. Going about it that way. Then, protecting, your house as best you can. And step one, and like I said, I'm going to be talking about this in much more detail in the first newsletter, but grounding. This is literally increasing your body's state of free electrons, which in my opinion actually might be the best source of antioxidants on the planet. It's actually the free electrons that we get by putting our feet, our hands on the grass, on the dirt, on the sand. If you go swimming in the ocean, all of these are going to be fantastic ways to ground, to equalize our electromagnetic field with that of the surface of the earth. It's effectively a battery. The planet is effectively a battery that we can ground to at any basis. And, because we spend so much time inside now, we wear rubber bottom shoes. We sleep in beds that aren't necessarily on the floor. We literally are not in touch with the earth at any point. So grounding, something that you can make a practice every day. It's going to help with your sleep. It's going to help with recovery, both muscle recovery and your ability to sleep. Sleep, all of it is going to be included. It's just, in my opinion, probably the most effective way to do it. If you haven't checked out the book Earthing by Clint Ober, I highly, highly recommend you do that. So that would be step one. Step two would be going from wireless to wired. Now, I talk about this all the time. There's a huge craze with these trackable devices, Oura Rings, Apple Watches, Whoop bands, Fitbits, all of these. All of these are going to emit wireless radiation in the area. Even worse, if you wear a Bluetooth earpiece that's on your head all the time. I mean, you can look into the studies that those who take phone calls, on one side of their head, you can see the difference that it makes over years. So just headphones, like I said, AirPods. So how AirPods work is wild. So there's a transmitter that goes, if it's hooked up to your iPhone, for example, it's going to go to one of the earpods. And then from that AirPod, it goes to the other one. And it does that literally by bouncing back and forth in between your head. That is how it goes essentially through your skull, through the brain, through the skull on the other side. And that's how you're hearing it in both ears. So imagine that bouncing back and forth all day, every year. And I can't tell you, just the people in my own life who have had issues with arrhythmias or heart challenges, that when they stop using it, they're like, wow, I just feel better. So going from wireless to wired is step one. Like, you certainly do not need an Apple Watch. You certainly don't need an Oura Ring or AirPods or any of this. Get stuff that is wired so that you don't have to potentially deal with these issues. So that easy, step one. Step two, I would say, would be to figure out what's going on with Wi-Fi in your house. I mean, it's important to say this now, like, there is no way that you're ever going to get zero exposure to this living in the modern world. It's just not going to happen. The best is to control the controllables. And with Wi-Fi, it's a huge, huge, huge thing. So at night, if you can shut off your Wi-Fi, you can go on Amazon or to a hardware store. You could get a timer and hook your wireless router up to it, so it could turn on when you wake up in the morning and shut off at night. That would be ideal. And it would just be set to a timer. So you could do it from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. And then it shuts off at 9 p.m. You go to sleep, wake up, and it's back. So, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. That's an easy one. If you use a keyboard or a mouse at a computer, try to get the wired ones that hook into, USB plugs. If you could use that. If you could hardwire your laptop to, use an Ethernet cord instead of Wi-Fi, that would be a fantastic option too. There's a lot of different ways you can go about it. But those are some easy ones. As far as cell phone, listen, I use my cell phone as my alarm clock in the morning. What I would do, or what I do is I have a bedroom that's fairly big. I put it on airplane mode. I put it on the opposite side of the room, which is from where I am, I would say maybe about 10 feet ballpark. And I leave it there overnight. So, you don't need to necessarily be next to it. I certainly, even on airplane mode, would not leave it next to my head. So like on the say end table right next to your bed, I would not do that. I would leave it on the other side of the room. Again, earbuds we kind of talked about. Get wired ones, throw out the AirPods. Certainly don't want to deal with them. That's another easy way to do it. What we're seeing is phone. So more phone safety. I need to keep this on. So a big thing with men and women is they tend to keep their phones, particularly when they're on, in places that are going to affect your fertility. And we actually know this now, that if men keep their phone in, say, like their side pockets, that is going to affect both the sperm quantity and quality in men. We see in women, particularly women who store their phones in their bra, are more susceptible to certain types of cancer, especially on that side of the body. So what's the best way? How do you deal with your phone? If you have a bag that you walk around with, put it in the bag, and ideally when you're not using it, keep it on airplane mode. So ideally not on your physical person and not on airplane mode as often as you possibly can. So, listen, obviously that's not going to happen all the time, but I think an easy way to go about it would to get it, out of the bra strap, out of the pockets, and ideally off, obviously not your back pocket, ideally not your front pocket. Ideally you would carry it in a bag, and ideally on airplane mode as much as you can. There are certain bags and stuff that you can get that are EMF protecting. I like the Defender Shield type of stuff. You can check the link out in my bio. They have cases, phone cases and laptop cases and different things, bags, things that you could kind of use if you want to look into that. There are EMF blocking blankets that you can use too. So all of that would be kind of useful too. So what's next here? We have other electric challenges here. So, oops. Sorry, I kind of lost my spot for a second. LEDs. So lighting's a big issue, and I know this is something that's actually changing fairly recently, but ideally, if you can get your hands on incandescent bulbs, that would be a much better option than using the LEDs. For one, is a lot of the new LED lights are actually hooked up to your Wi-Fi and solar panels, so they're connected, which is ideally not something that you would want, because that's another current that needs to go around and that's going to be in your field, right? So that's not ideal. I always am a bigger fan of incandescent bulbs if you could get them. What else? Yeah, if you're trying to, shield your house from 4 or 5G, more so 5G. Like I said, there are some wireless shielding fabrics, things like silver line things tend to do really well. There's certain clothing, underwear, t-shirts, things of that nature that are usually lined with silver that can really help dissipate a lot of this, which is really helpful. That would go, a really long way. Another thing would be, is affecting both the blood-brain barrier and the gut. So the more EMFs that we're exposed to can cause leaky brain. And we actually see this, that the brain becomes leaky. Literally certain things that should get through to the brain that often wouldn't are now doing that. The gut microbiota starts to change as well. The microbiome will start to change with exposure to EMFs over time. So, and things that are going to make it worse are things like glyphosate exposure and pesticide exposure. All of these are going to, play a role. So as far as the nutrition standpoint, like, you certainly want to focus on certain nutrients that are going to play a role. So in this case, like selenium, we know is an antioxidant. Why is that going to play a role? Antioxidant, right? These are going to supply the electrons to balance out, to neutralize the free radicals that we're talking about. Potassium, similar thing. It's needed for proper heart rate and heart contraction. It's a major electrolyte. Electrolytes are going to carry electrons with them. So that's a big one. Fruits, vegetables, avocados, tomatoes, bananas, potatoes, mushrooms, seaweeds, all good sources of potassium, of selenium, because I didn't mention it. Things like seaweeds, Brazil nuts, garlic, onion, mushrooms, sunflower seeds. Things that are grown in selenium-rich soils, those are going to be big. Zinc, similar thing, really important for conductivity, going to be great for immune system health, for collagen formation, to make sure those tissues are strong and tight, that you're not getting leaky type of issues like leaky brain or leaky gut. You need zinc for that. Good sources of that, all different types of seeds, hemp, pumpkin, chia seeds, walnuts, cashews, quinoa, ginger, mushrooms, seaweeds. All of these are going to be really good sources. Copper is also going to be something that's really nice. Now, generally, there's a balance between copper and zinc, but if you're getting it from foods, this usually isn't an issue. Things like leafy greens, lentils, nuts, cashews, quinoa, pecans, molasses. Nature honestly provides a lot of this stuff for you. So, getting these foods is going to be really big. As far as radiation in general, iodine is really important. And this is why I really enjoy things like kelps and seaweeds that are really good sources of iodine. Chlorella, spirulina, you hear me talk about this all of the time. Vitamin C goes without saying. So again, fruits and vegetables, citrus fruits specifically, blackberries, papaya, mango, guava, persimmons, apples, peppers, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, broccoli. All these are going to be good sources of vitamin C. Humic and fulvic acid, I also need to say here, one of the reasons is because that's going to be one of the best ways to build up your microbiome over time, because it essentially helps lay the foundation for a healthier microbiome. So certainly, like, fulvic and humic acids are going to go a really long way too. So, and of course, grounding. So listen, this isn't necessarily something that's going to go away overnight. You're never going to get your exposure down to zero in the modern world, and that's okay. The best thing you could do is control the controllables, and there's a lot that you have in your control. So, go through kind of what you can, what we talked about. If you start practicing some of this, you will help. I would say it will help. I will say I do recommend getting some sort of grounding in on a regular basis. So, like I mentioned before, you could even do it in socks, by the way, because your feet tend to sweat a lot, and the water, any sort of liquid, is going to be conducive. So you can actually ground in socks if you really wanted to. If you had leather bottom shoes, which is what a lot of people used to have, versus these rubber or plastic soled shoes that are going to negate that, that's going to be a big issue too. So those are the big things. I hope you took some notes. I'm going to put this on YouTube probably tomorrow. Real quick though, before we go, so this is actually something I'm going to be working on the rest of the day, but I'm really excited. So I'm going to be launching a new program that's going to be called The Road to Regeneration, and it'll be working with me for 12 weeks, going through the fundamentals of detox and real health, true health, in my opinion. And more importantly, building an education and a plan for you so that you can take it beyond. And you'll get coaching from me the entire time. we'll work together to come up with a plan for you. And then more importantly, you get the education so you're empowered to make more decisions so that you don't need to rely on a doctor like me forever. You'll have the information, you'll get empowered. We'll cover everything from hormones to action steps to nutrition to immune system and lymphatic function. I mean, it's going to be very in-depth, and the goal is to get you to a point, like I said, where you don't need to work with someone like me. I'm going to be hosting a webinar on it tomorrow, and I might actually have the replays available. So I will put more information on that out. If it's something you're interested in, shoot me a DM because I could certainly send you the link for it. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to honestly working with you because ultimately we need more folks who are not only interested in health, but like are acting on it on a regular basis. And, I see us getting there. I see us working in the right direction. And I think with the fundamentals and the education on solid foundational principles, we're going to get there. So I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for hanging out with me, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.